The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital cast harsh shadows across the break room as Rebecca Martinez finished her third double shift this week. At 31, she moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to waste no energy on unnecessary movements. Her long brown hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her simple paramedic uniform bore none of the personality pins or patches that decorated her colleagues' clothing. "She never talks to anyone," whispered Jessica, a young nurse barely out of school, as she watched Rebecca methodically clean and organize her personal medical kit. "It's like she thinks she's better than the rest of us." "Maybe because she actually knows what she's doing," countered Mark, an experienced paramedic who had worked alongside Rebecca for 6 months. "I've never seen anyone prep equipment like that. It's like she's getting ready for war or something." Rebecca didn't react to their conversation, though she heard every word. She had learned long ago that silence was often the best defense against curiosity. Her hands moved with practiced precision as she checked each instrument, replaced expired supplies, and ensured everything was positioned exactly where muscle memory would expect to find it. Dr. Patricia Wilson, the head of emergency medicine, burst through the break room doors with her usual commanding presence. "Martinez, you're with Transport Team 3 today. We've got a nursing home pickup in an hour." "Yes, ma'am," Rebecca replied, her voice steady but distant. Dr. Wilson paused, studying Rebecca's face for a moment. There was something about this paramedic that she couldn't quite place. In 30 years of emergency medicine, she had worked with hundreds of paramedics, but none carried themselves quite like Rebecca Martinez. There was a stillness about her, a watchfulness that seemed almost military in its precision. "Martinez," Dr. Wilson called out as Rebecca headed toward the door. "Where did you do your paramedic training?" Rebecca's hand froze on the door handle for just a fraction of a second before she turned back. "Community college program in Texas, ma'am. Standard certification." It was the truth, technically. What she didn't mention was the intensive combat medical training that had preceded it, or the fact that her standard certification had been earned while she was trying to forget everything she had learned about medicine under fire. As Rebecca walked through the hospital corridors, she noticed an elderly man gripping the handrail in the hallway, confusion clouding his weathered features. Without breaking stride, she approached him quietly. "Are you looking for someone, sir?" she asked, her voice gentler than anyone at the hospital had ever heard it. I can't remember which room. The old man stammered, his hand shaking. Rebecca placed a steady hand on his arm. "Let's check your wristband. Room 215. That's just down this hall. Would you like me to walk with you?" She guided him back to his room, straightened his blanket, and filled his water pitcher before the nurses even noticed he had wandered off. It was the kind of quiet competence that defined her work, efficient, thorough, and invisible. But as Rebecca headed back toward the ambulance bay, the emergency alarms began to shriek. "Incoming trauma." Dr. Wilson's voice boomed over the intercom. "ETA 3 minutes. Multiple GSWs, special operations personnel." The entire emergency department erupted into controlled chaos. Rebecca found herself swept along with the crowd of medical personnel gathering near the trauma bay doors. Through the glass, she could see the ambulance lights approaching fast. "Step back, Martinez," snapped Dr. Henderson, a young resident who had always treated paramedics as little more than glorified taxi drivers. "This is going to be serious surgery. Transport personnel need to clear the area." Rebecca nodded and moved toward the back of the crowd, but her eyes remained fixed on the approaching stretcher. Even from a distance, she could see the characteristic spray pattern of arterial bleeding soaking through the field dressings. Her hands unconsciously moved toward her equipment belt as old instincts began to surface. The trauma team wheeled the patient into the bay, and Rebecca caught her first clear look at the injuries. The soldier was young, maybe 25, with the lean build and short haircut that marked him as special operations. But it was the wound that made her breath catch, a jagged tear in the abdomen that she recognized. Immediately, she had seen this exact type of injury before. Many times. In places where the difference between life and death was measured in seconds, not minutes. "We need to get him to OR stat," Dr. Henderson called out, but his voice carried the uncertainty of someone who had never worked under real pressure. Rebecca watched as the medical team began their assessment, and every fiber of her being screamed that they were moving too slowly. The patient's blood pressure was dropping, his breathing was becoming shallow, and the arterial bleeding that had been temporarily controlled in the field was starting to seep through the bandages again. In combat zones, she would have had this bleeding controlled in under 30 seconds. The patient would already be stabilized and ready for surgical repair. But here, in this sterile environment with its protocols and hierarchies, precious seconds were ticking away while doctors consulted charts and discussed procedures. "His pressure's dropping fast," called out Lisa, the charge nurse, her voice tight with concern. Rebecca's hands clenched involuntarily. She could see exactly what needed to be done, could visualize the precise placement of clamps and sutures. That would save this soldier's life. But she was just a paramedic. Her job was to transport patients, not to perform the kind of emergency surgery that was clearly needed here. The monitors began to beat more urgently, and Rebecca noticed something that made her blood run cold. The medical team was preparing to administer general anesthesia before controlling the bleeding, a protocol that worked fine for stable patients but would be fatal for someone in this condition. She took a half step forward, then stopped herself. This wasn't her operating theater. These weren't her rules. And revealing what she was truly capable of would open doors to a past she had spent years trying to keep closed. But as the anesthesia mask approached the soldier's face, Rebecca realized that some things were more important than keeping secrets. Some things were worth the risk of exposure. This young soldier deserved to go home alive. The tension in Trauma Bay 2 was thick enough to cut with a scalpel as Dr. Henderson prepared the anesthesia. Rebecca stood frozen at the edge of the crowd, watching the soldier's vital signs deteriorate with each passing second. His skin was growing pale, his breathing shallow, all signs she had witnessed too many times before in very different circumstances. "Doctor," Rebecca called out, her voice cutting through the controlled chaos. "You might want to control that bleeding before." "Martinez," Dr. Henderson snapped without looking up. "I told you to clear the area. This is complex trauma surgery, not transport call." The dismissal stung, but not because of wounded pride. Rebecca had learned to swallow her ego years ago when lives were on the line. What bothered her was watching a soldier die from injuries she could treat in her sleep, simply because hospital politics prevented her from acting. "She's right, though," Mark whispered to Jessica near the back of the crowd. "Look at his pressure. The bleeding's getting worse." Dr. Wilson approached Rebecca with a stern expression. "Martinez, Dr. Henderson, is correct. This is outside your scope of practice. Please return to your regular duties." Rebecca nodded silently and backed away, but she didn't leave the trauma bay. Instead, she positioned herself where she could maintain visual contact with the patient while staying out of the direct line of fire. Her trained eye continued to assess the situation, calculating blood loss rates and estimating how much time they had left. 3 minutes, she estimated. Maybe 4, if they were lucky. Dr. Henderson finally looked up from his preparations and noticed Rebecca still lurking near the doorway. "Is there a problem, Martinez? I believe you were given clear instructions." "No problem, sir," Rebecca replied evenly. "Just making sure our equipment gets returned to the ambulance." It was a thin excuse, and everyone knew it, but it bought her a few more precious minutes of observation time. She watched as the trauma team fumbled with procedures that should have been second nature, debated treatment options that had obvious answers, and followed protocols that prioritized documentation over immediate, life-saving intervention. The soldier's blood pressure dropped another 10 points. "We're losing him," announced Lisa, her voice tight with professional concern that barely masked rising panic. Dr. Henderson's hands shook slightly as he reached for the anesthesia mask again. Rebecca saw her opportunity evaporating. Once the patient was unconscious, any chance of stabilizing him before surgery would be lost. The arterial bleeding would continue unchecked, and by the time they got him to the operating room, it would be too late. "Doctor," Rebecca called out again, this time more urgently. "That artery needs to be clamped before anesthesia, or you're going to lose him." The entire trauma bay went silent. Every head turned toward Rebecca, and she could feel the weight of their collective stare. She had crossed a line, challenged medical authority in front of the entire emergency team. There would be consequences. Dr. Henderson's face flushed red with anger. "Martinez, you are completely out of line. Security." But before security could respond, the monitors began to alarm more urgently. The soldier's blood pressure was dropping fast, his heart rate becoming erratic. Whatever protocol disputes existed, it was clear that immediate action was needed. Dr. Wilson stepped forward, her experienced eye taking in the patient's deteriorating condition. "Henderson, she might have a point. The bleeding is getting worse." "With respect, Dr. Wilson, I won't take medical advice from a paramedic," Dr. Henderson replied, his voice dripping with condescension. "Martinez, you're suspended from duty pending a disciplinary review. Report to administration immediately." Rebecca felt the familiar cold calm that had carried her through countless life-and-death situations. Being suspended meant losing her job, but watching a soldier die meant losing something far more important. The choice was surprisingly easy. "I understand, doctor," she said quietly, "but that soldier has maybe 90 seconds before he bleeds out. Clamp the superior mesenteric artery first, then the splenic. Control the bleeding before you do anything else." Dr. Henderson's face turned purple with rage. "Security, remove this woman from my trauma bay immediately." But as the security guard approached, Dr. Wilson held up her hand. Despite her irritation at Rebecca's insubordination, she had been practicing emergency medicine long enough to recognize expertise when she heard it. The specificity of Rebecca's instructions, the confidence in her voice. These weren't the words of someone guessing. "Wait," Dr. Wilson said. "Martinez, how do you know about the superior mesenteric artery?" Rebecca hesitated. This was the moment she had been dreading for months. The inevitable confrontation between her carefully constructed civilian identity and the professional skills that defined who she really was. She could lie, deflect, and accept her suspension. Or she could tell the truth and deal with the consequences. The soldier's monitor showed another alarming drop in blood pressure. "Because I've seen this exact injury pattern before, ma'am," Rebecca said quietly. "Many times." "Where?" Dr. Wilson pressed. Rebecca met her gaze steadily. "Iraq, Afghanistan, other places." The trauma bay went completely silent except for the urgent beeping of monitors. Every person in the room was staring at Rebecca with new eyes, suddenly seeing not just a quiet paramedic, but someone whose experience might extend far beyond their assumptions. Dr. Henderson laughed harshly. "Right. I suppose you're going to tell us you were some kind of special forces medic." Rebecca didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked directly at the dying soldier, then back at Dr. Henderson. When she spoke, her voice carried a quiet authority that made everyone in the room lean forward to listen. "Delta Force, actually. Chief medic for 7 years. And that soldier is going to die in the next 60 seconds if someone doesn't clamp that artery right now." A silence that followed was deafening. Rebecca had just revealed the one secret she had sworn to keep buried, thrown away years of carefully maintained anonymity, all for a stranger whose life hung in the balance. But as she watched the trauma team absorb her words, she realized that some secrets weren't worth keeping. When they came at the cost of a soldier's life, the trauma bay erupted in chaos as Rebecca's revelation sank in. Dr. Henderson stood frozen, anesthesia mask still in hand, while every pair of eyes in the room shifted between the dying soldier and the paramedic who claimed to be one of the military's most elite medics. "She's lying," Dr. Henderson finally sputtered. "This is just some desperate attempt to avoid disciplinary action. Delta Force doesn't recruit women for 40 seconds. Rebecca interrupted, her voice cutting through his protests with surgical precision. "That's how long he has before irreversible shock sets in." Dr. Wilson stepped closer, her experienced eye studying Rebecca's face. "If you're telling the truth, then why haven't you acted already?" "Because I'm not licensed to practice surgery in this hospital," Rebecca replied. "But licensing won't matter if he's dead." The monitors screamed louder as the soldier's blood pressure plummeted. His skin had taken on the waxy pallor that Rebecca recognized as the beginning of the end. She had seen too many good soldiers reach this point, and she knew exactly how much time they had left. 30 seconds, she announced. Dr. Henderson finally moved, but toward the anesthesia equipment instead of the bleeding. "I'm not going to let some delusional paramedic dictate medical treatment in my trauma bay." That's when Rebecca made the decision that would change everything. "Step aside, doctor." Her voice had changed completely. Gone was the quiet deference of the civilian paramedic. In its place was the unmistakable authority of someone who had commanded life and death situations in the world's most dangerous places. The transformation was so complete that even Dr. Henderson hesitated. "Martinez, don't," Dr. Wilson warned. "If you're wrong about this, I'm not wrong," Rebecca said, already moving toward the patient. "I've done this exact procedure 43 times under enemy fire. I'm not going to let him die because of hospital politics." She reached the patient's side and immediately began her assessment. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, palpating the abdomen, checking pulse points, evaluating the wound pattern. Everything she saw confirmed her initial diagnosis. "Lisa, I need hemostats, curved forceps, and 4-0 silk sutures," Rebecca called out, her voice now carrying the confident authority of a battlefield surgeon. "You can't just..." Dr. Henderson started to protest, but Dr. Wilson cut him off. "Get her what she needs," the chief of emergency medicine ordered. Now, Lisa hesitated for just a moment, then began gathering the requested instruments. Something in Rebecca's demeanor had convinced her that this was no ordinary paramedic making desperate claims. 20 seconds, Rebecca announced as she positioned herself over the patient, with movements too fast and precise for civilian-trained eyes to follow. Rebecca's hands found the source of the bleeding. She identified the damaged artery, positioned her clamps, and began the delicate process of controlling the hemorrhage that was killing the soldier. "Pressure's stabilizing," Lisa called out, her voice filled with amazement. Rebecca's hands never paused. She worked with the fluid efficiency of someone who had performed this procedure so many times that it had become muscle memory. Clamp, suture, check for secondary bleeding, clamp again. Each movement was economical and perfect. "How is she doing that so fast?" whispered Jessica to Mark. "Because she's telling the truth," Mark replied, his voice filled with awe. "Look at her hands. That's not paramedic training. That's combat medicine." Dr. Wilson moved closer to observe Rebecca's technique. In 30 years of emergency medicine, she had never seen anyone work with such controlled precision under pressure. This wasn't textbook surgery. This was something far more refined and dangerous. Where did you learn to work that fast, Doctor? Wilson asked quietly. Fallujah, mostly, Rebecca replied without looking up from her work. When you're performing surgery in the back of a moving Humvee while taking sniper fire, you learn to be efficient. The trauma bay had gone completely silent, except for the steady beeping of monitors showing dramatically improved vital signs. Everyone watched in fascination as Rebecca completed the arterial repair with movements that seemed almost choreographed. Bleeding controlled, she announced, stepping back from the patient. He's stable for transport to OR. Dr. Henderson stared at the patient's improved condition, then at Rebecca, his face cycling through disbelief, anger, and something that might have been grudging respect. That's impossible, he stammered. No one works that fast. You do when lives depend on it, Rebecca replied, beginning to clean blood from her hands with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else Dr. Wilson studied. The surgical work Rebecca had just completed. The sutures were perfect, the technique flawless, the results undeniable. This level of skill didn't come from textbooks or simulation training. It came from real experience under the worst possible conditions. Martinez, Dr. Wilson said slowly, we need to talk. My office, now. Rebecca nodded, knowing that her carefully constructed civilian life was about to be examined and probably destroyed. But as she looked at the soldier's stable vital signs and improved color, she realized she didn't regret her choice. Some things were worth the cost of exposure. Some secrets weren't worth keeping when they came at the expense of a human life. As the trauma team prepared to transport the soldier to the operating room, Rebecca quietly gathered her equipment and prepared for the conversation that would determine whether she still had a job by the end of the day. But for the first time in months, she felt like herself again. The quiet paramedic who had hidden in plain sight was gone, replaced by the combat medic who had never learned to accept defeat when lives were on the line. The reckoning she had been avoiding was finally here. Dr. Wilson's office felt like a courtroom. As Rebecca sat across from the chief of emergency medicine, her personnel file spread open on the desk between them. The afternoon sun streaming through the windows seemed harsh and unforgiving, highlighting every detail of what was about to become a very difficult conversation. Rebecca Martinez, age 31, graduated from Austin Community College's paramedic program 3 years ago. Dr. Wilson read aloud. Previous work history shows employment at a private ambulance service in San Antonio before joining us 6 months ago. Rebecca sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, waiting for the inevitable questions about the gaps in her official biography. What's interesting, Dr. Wilson continued, is what's not in this file. No military service record. No advanced medical training. Nothing that would explain what I just witnessed in my trauma bay. I completed all the required certifications for my position, Rebecca replied carefully. That's not what I'm asking, and you know it. Dr. Wilson closed the file and leaned back in her chair. I've been practicing emergency medicine for 30 years. I've worked with combat medics, trauma surgeons, and some of the best medical professionals in the country. What you did in there wasn't just good medicine. It was extraordinary. Rebecca remained silent, but Dr. Wilson pressed on. The technique you used to control that arterial bleeding, I've never seen it before. The speed, the precision, the way you knew exactly what instruments you needed without looking. That doesn't come from community college paramedic training. I've had additional experience, Rebecca said finally. Where? The question hung in the air between them. Rebecca had spent years perfecting the art of deflection, of giving answers that were technically true while revealing nothing important. But the look in Dr. Wilson's eyes suggested that simple evasion wasn't going to work this time. You mentioned Delta Force in the trauma bay, Dr. Wilson said. I need to know if that was true or if you were just trying to establish credibility. In a crisis situation, Rebecca met her gaze directly. It was true. Dr. Wilson nodded slowly, as if she had expected this answer. How long? 7 years. Chief medic for the last 4. And you left to become a civilian paramedic because... The simple question opened wounds that Rebecca had spent years trying to heal. How could she explain the weight of carrying so many lives in her hands, the impossible decisions made under fire, the way combat medicine had both defined and consumed her? I wanted a normal life, she said quietly. I wanted to help people without having to worry about getting shot while doing it. Dr. Wilson studied her carefully. But you kept your skills sharp. That level of proficiency doesn't maintain itself. Rebecca nodded. I practice. Privately. I've converted part of my garage into a medical training area. I work through procedures, maintain my edge. Old habits. Why hide it? Those skills could benefit every patient who comes through our doors. Because I didn't want this, Rebecca gestured around the office. I didn't want questions, investigations, people looking into my background. I just wanted to do my job quietly. Dr. Wilson leaned forward. Rebecca, I'm going to be direct with you. What happened in that trauma bay today has created a situation. Dr. Henderson is filing a formal complaint about your conduct. He's claiming you exceeded your scope of practice, endangered a patient, and created a hostile work environment. Rebecca had expected this. Hospital politics were just as treacherous as military bureaucracy, and she had violated several unwritten rules by challenging medical authority so publicly. I understand, she said. But, Dr. Wilson continued, I'm also going to be investigating something else. We've had 3 trauma cases in the past 2 months where patients died from complications we should have been able to manage. Arterial bleeding, specifically. Rebecca felt something cold settle in her stomach. You think you could have saved them? I think someone with your skills might have been able to save them. And I think this hospital needs to seriously examine whether our current trauma protocols are adequate for the cases we're seeing. The implications of Dr. Wilson's words were staggering. Rebecca had been watching fellow medical professionals struggle with cases she could have handled, staying silent while people died to protect her own carefully constructed anonymity. Dr. Wilson, Rebecca said slowly, if you're asking whether I could have helped with those cases, the answer is probably yes. But I wasn't invited to consult, and I couldn't volunteer without revealing things I wasn't ready to reveal. And now? Rebecca considered the question carefully. Her secret was out, at least partially. The investigation that would follow would inevitably uncover more details about her military service. The quiet civilian life she had built was already crumbling. Now, I guess it doesn't matter what I was ready for, she said. Dr. Wilson made note in Rebecca's file. I'm going to be honest with you. This investigation is going to be thorough. Henderson's complaint will require a full review of your actions, your qualifications, and your background. But I'm also going to be looking into whether this hospital has been adequately utilizing available medical expertise. What does that mean for my job? That depends on what we find. But Rebecca, I want you to know something. What you did today saved that soldier's life. Henderson can file all the complaints he wants, but the fact remains that his approach would have killed the patient. Rebecca nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and apprehension. The truth was finally out, but she had no idea where it would lead. There's something else, Dr. Wilson said. I've made some calls, discreet inquiries about your military service. The few people I could reach who were willing to talk all said the same thing, which was that Rebecca Martinez was one of the finest combat medics they'd ever worked with. That you volunteered for the most dangerous missions because you knew your skills could make the difference between soldiers coming home alive or not coming home at all. The words hit Rebecca like a physical blow. She had spent so long running from her military identity that hearing it acknowledged and respected felt almost overwhelming. They also said you left because you'd seen enough death to last several lifetimes and that you'd earned the right to find some peace. Rebecca felt tears threatening for the first time in years. I thought I could just blend in. Be normal. But normal isn't who you are, Dr. Wilson said gently. And maybe it's time to stop pretending otherwise. The hospital cafeteria buzzed with whispered conversations as Rebecca sat alone at a corner table, picking at a sandwich she had no appetite for. Word of the Trauma Bay incident had spread quickly through the hospital's gossip network, and she could feel curious glances from every direction. Mind if I sit? Rebecca looked up to find Mark standing with his lunch tray, his expression serious but not unfriendly. She gestured to the empty chair across from her. Rough morning, he said, settling into his seat. You could say that. Mark studied her face carefully. You know, I've been thinking about some of the calls we've run together. The way you handle trauma patients, the questions you ask, the things you notice that the rest of us miss. Rebecca tensed, wondering if this was another interrogation disguised as friendly conversation. Like that motorcycle accident last month, Mark continued. You took one look at that guy's chest and told EO to prep for emergency surgery. Turned out, he had internal bleeding that didn't show up on the initial scans. Lucky guess, Rebecca said quietly. No, it wasn't. And neither was what happened in that trauma bay today. Mark leaned forward. I did 2 tours in Afghanistan as a medic. Army, not special forces. But I saw enough combat medicine to recognize the real thing when I see it. Rebecca met his eyes, seeing understanding rather than judgment. The way you moved, the confidence in your voice when you gave those orders. That wasn't paramedic training. That was battlefield experience. Mark paused. Delta Force? Rebecca nodded reluctantly. Jesus, Mark breathed. No wonder you always seemed like you were operating on a different level than the rest of us. Before Rebecca could respond, Lisa approached their table with her own lunch tray. Rebecca, I hope you don't mind if I join you. Of course, Rebecca said, though she wondered if the charge nurse was there in an official capacity. Lisa sat down and immediately got to the point. I've been reviewing the charts from this morning. That soldier's vital signs improved dramatically after your intervention. His blood pressure stabilized, his heart rate normalized, and his oxygen saturation went from critical to stable. The surgical team did excellent work once he reached the OR, Rebecca deflected. The surgical team had a stable patient to work with because of what you did in the trauma bay, Lisa corrected. Rebecca, I've been a trauma nurse for 15 years. I've seen a lot of good medicine and a lot of bad medicine. What you did was exceptional. Rebecca felt uncomfortable with the praise. I just did what needed to be done. Exactly, Lisa said. And that's what has some of us asking questions. What kind of questions? Mark and Lisa exchanged glances before Lisa continued. We've been talking with some of the other staff about cases we've lost, patients we couldn't save. There have been several situations where additional expertise might have made a difference. You can't save everyone, Rebecca said automatically, the words carrying the weight of hard-learned experience. No, but we should save everyone we can, Mark replied. And it's becoming clear that we might not be doing that. Lisa pulled out a tablet and showed Rebecca a series of patient charts. 3 cases in the past 2 months. All trauma patients with arterial bleeding. All deaths that might have been preventable with different treatment approaches. Rebecca studied the charts, her trained eye immediately identifying the critical decision points where alternative techniques might have changed the outcomes. The familiar ache of preventable loss settled in her chest. You see it too, don't you? Lisa said quietly. I see what happened, Rebecca replied carefully. Could you have saved them? The question hung heavy in the air. Rebecca looked at the charts. Again, seeing not just medical data but human lives that had ended while she stood silently on the sidelines, protecting her own secrets. Maybe, she said finally. I don't know. But different approaches might have given them better chances. Mark leaned forward. That's what we thought. Rebecca, we want you to know that not everyone agrees with Dr. Henderson's complaint. A lot of the staff think what you did today was exactly what needed to happen. The thing is, Lisa added, we've been wondering if there are other situations where your expertise could have made a difference. Where maybe we didn't know to ask for help because we didn't know what kind of help was available. Rebecca understood what they were really asking. They wanted to know if her silence had cost lives, if her desire for anonymity had contributed to preventable deaths. I never wanted anyone to die because I was trying to blend in, she said quietly. We know that, Mark replied. But we also think this hospital could benefit from having someone with your level of expertise available for consultation on difficult cases. Assuming I still have a job after Henderson's investigation, Rebecca said. Lisa smiled. I think you'll be surprised by how many people are willing to speak up about what really happened in that trauma bay, and about what this hospital needs to better serve our trauma patients. As if summoned by their conversation, Dr. Wilson appeared at their table. Rebecca, I need to speak with you. Rebecca's stomach tightened, expecting more bad news about the investigation. I'd be making more calls about your military service, Dr. Wilson said. Very interesting conversations. Oh? It seems that several military medical officers I spoke with have been wondering what happened to Chief Medic Rebecca Martinez. Apparently, you developed some innovative trauma techniques that were adopted throughout special operations medical units. Rebecca felt exposed and proud simultaneously. I did some training development work. More than that. According to Colonel James Patterson at Walter Reed, you revolutionized battlefield trauma response and special operations. Your techniques reduce preventable deaths in Delta Force missions by 60%. The statistic hit Rebecca like a physical blow. She had never seen her work quantified in such stark terms. Colonel Patterson also said something else, Dr. Wilson continued. He said that losing you to civilian life was one of the military's greatest losses in recent years. He said your skills were too valuable to waste. Rebecca looked around the table at the faces watching her. Mark with his understanding, Lisa with her professional respect, Dr. Wilson with her growing recognition of what they had stumbled upon. What exactly are you suggesting? Rebecca asked. Doctor. Wilson smiled. I'm suggesting that it's time for Rebecca Martinez to stop hiding from who she really is. And I'm suggesting that this hospital is ready to learn from one of the finest combat medics in the country. For the first time in months, Rebecca felt a spark of something she had almost forgotten, the sense of purpose that came from using her skills to their fullest potential. Dr. Wilson's conference room had been transformed into a war room of sorts, with patient charts spread across the table, medical journals stacked in neat piles, and a large whiteboard covered with Rebecca's precise handwriting detailing advanced trauma protocols. This is the third revision of your proposed training program, Dr. Wilson said, reviewing Rebecca's latest submission. It's comprehensive, but I need you to understand what we're up against. Rebecca nodded, already aware that changing established medical protocols would be an uphill battle. Henderson's complaint? Henderson's complaint is just the beginning. The hospital board is conservative, liability conscious, and skeptical of anything that deviates from standard procedures. They're going to want evidence that your methods are both safe and effective. They are, Rebecca said simply. I have 7 years of field data to prove it. Military field data, Dr. Wilson corrected, which some board members will argue isn't applicable to civilian hospital settings. Rebecca had anticipated this objection. The human body doesn't change based on geography. Arterial bleeding works the same way whether it happens in downtown Houston or in Fallujah. Mark entered the conference room carrying a thick folder of documents. "I've got the research you requested," he said, setting the folder on the table. "Journal articles, case studies, outcome analyses from trauma centers that have adopted modified military medical techniques." Dr. Wilson opened the folder and began reviewing its contents. "This is exactly what we need. Evidence-based research showing that military medical innovations can improve civilian trauma outcomes." Rebecca had spent the past week working with Mark and Lisa to build a comprehensive case for integrating combat medical techniques into the hospital's trauma protocols. They had researched similar programs at other hospitals, compiled outcome statistics, and prepared detailed cost-benefit analyses. "The data is compelling," Lisa said, entering the room with her own stack of charts. "Hospitals that have incorporated military-style trauma protocols show significantly improved survival rates for severe trauma patients." Dr. Wilson studied the research with growing interest. "These numbers are impressive. Baltimore Shock Trauma Center improved their survival rate for penetrating trauma by 23% after implementing modified battlefield techniques." "The key word is modified," Rebecca emphasized. "I'm not suggesting we turn the ER into a field hospital. I'm proposing that we adapt proven battlefield techniques for civilian use, maintaining all safety protocols while improving response times." The door opened and Colonel Patterson entered, his dress uniform immaculate and his bearing unmistakably military. Rebecca stood instinctively, old habits asserting themselves. "Chief Martinez," he said with a slight smile. "It's good to see you again." "Colonel Patterson, thank you for coming." Dr. Wilson had arranged for Colonel Patterson to provide expert testimony about Rebecca's military service and the effectiveness of her medical innovations. His presence would lend credibility to their proposal that civilian skeptics would find difficult to dismiss. "Dr. Wilson has filled me in on the situation," Colonel Patterson said, taking a seat at the conference table. "I have to say, I'm not surprised that Chief Martinez has continued to excel in civilian medicine." "Can you speak to her qualifications and the techniques she developed?" Dr. Wilson asked. Colonel Patterson opened his briefcase and pulled out a classified folder. "What I can tell you is limited by security considerations, but Chief Martinez was responsible for developing trauma protocols that became standard throughout special operations medical units. Her work saved hundreds of lives." He turned to Rebecca. "I also understand you've been keeping your skills current?" Rebecca nodded. "I have a training facility at home. I practice regularly." "Good, because I have a proposition for you, Colonel." Patterson's expression became serious. "The military is interested in establishing a civilian military medical exchange program. We send our medics to learn from civilian trauma centers, and civilian hospitals receive training in battlefield medical techniques." Rebecca felt her pulse quicken. "You want me to be part of this program?" "I want you to lead it," Colonel Patterson replied. "Your unique experience bridging military and civilian medicine makes you the ideal candidate to develop protocols that work in both environments." Dr. Wilson leaned forward with interest. "What would this mean for the hospital?" "Federal funding for equipment upgrades, training programs, and research initiatives," Colonel Patterson explained. "Plus access to some of the most advanced trauma medical techniques in the world." The implications were staggering. Not only would Rebecca's expertise be officially recognized and utilized, but the hospital would receive significant resources to improve their trauma care capabilities. "There's something else," Colonel Patterson said, directing his attention to Rebecca. "We've been tracking outcomes at hospitals where former special operations medics have taken positions. The improvement in trauma survival rates is remarkable." He pulled out a tablet and showed them a series of charts and graphs. Hospitals with former Delta Force medics on staff show an average improvement of 35% in severe trauma survival rates. Your innovations aren't just saving individual lives, they're revolutionizing civilian trauma care. Rebecca stared at the data, stunned by the scope of impact her techniques were having beyond her direct involvement. The question is, Colonel Patterson continued, are you ready to stop hiding your capabilities and start using them to their full potential? Before Rebecca could answer, Dr. Henderson appeared in the doorway, his face flushed with anger. What is this? He demanded, looking around the room at the assembled group. Some kind of military tribunal? Dr. Wilson stood calmly. Dr. Henderson, we're conducting a comprehensive review of our trauma protocols and exploring opportunities for improvement. By listening to a paramedic who violated every protocol we have, Henderson's voice rose. She endangered a patient, exceeded her scope of practice, and created chaos in my trauma bay. Colonel Patterson studied Henderson with the cool assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating character under pressure. Doctor, I understand you filed a complaint about Chief Martinez's actions. Chief Martinez? Henderson laughed harshly. She's a paramedic with delusions of grandeur. Actually, Colonel Patterson replied, his voice carrying quiet authority, she's one of the most decorated combat medics in recent military history. Her trauma protocols have been adopted throughout special operations units worldwide. Henderson's confident demeanor wavered slightly. Even if that's true, military medicine doesn't translate to civilian hospital settings. The patient she saved this morning would disagree, Mark interjected. His vital signs were failing under standard protocols. Her intervention stabilized him and saved his life. One case doesn't justify. It's not one case, Lisa interrupted, pulling out her tablet. I'd been reviewing our trauma outcomes for the past year. We've lost 7 patients to complications that might have been preventable, with different treatment approaches. She showed Henderson the data she had compiled. Patients with arterial bleeding, specifically. Our current protocols resulted in a 73% survival rate. Hospitals using modified military techniques report survival rates over 90% for similar cases. Henderson studied the data, his expression growing increasingly uncomfortable as the implications became clear. Furthermore, Dr. Wilson added, the hospital board has expressed interest in Colonel Patterson's proposed exchange program. The federal funding alone would allow us to upgrade our trauma facilities significantly. You're talking about changing fundamental medical protocols based on the recommendations of someone who isn't even a licensed physician. Henderson protested. I'm talking about saving more lives, Dr. Wilson replied firmly, which I thought was our primary objective. Colonel Patterson stood, his presence commanding the room's attention. Dr. Henderson, I've reviewed the case files Dr. Wilson provided. In every situation where you lost a trauma patient, Chief Martinez's techniques would have provided a better chance of survival. That's speculation. No, it's statistics based on hundreds of documented cases. Chief Martinez's innovations have been tested under the most demanding conditions possible. They work. Rebecca had remained silent during the exchange, but now she stood and faced Henderson directly. Doctor, I don't want your job or your authority. I just want to help save lives. If my experience can contribute to better patient outcomes, isn't that worth considering? Henderson looked around the room at the faces watching him. Dr. Wilson's determined expression, Colonel Patterson's professional assessment, the research data that contradicted his assumptions, and Rebecca's quiet confidence. This is irregular, he said finally, his voice lacking its earlier conviction. So is losing patients we should be able to save, Dr. Wilson replied. The board meeting is scheduled for tomorrow morning. I suggest you review the materials we've prepared. As Henderson left the conference room, Colonel Patterson turned to Rebecca. Are you ready for this? Once you accept this position, there's no going back to anonymity. Rebecca looked around the room at the people who had supported her, the research. That validated her techniques and the opportunity to use her skills to their fullest potential. I think I've been ready for a long time, she said. I just didn't know it. The hospital boardroom felt like a courtroom as Rebecca sat at the long mahogany table, facing 12 board members who held her professional future in their hands. Dr. Wilson sat to her right, Colonel Patterson to her left, and across the table, Dr. Henderson shuffled through his prepared complaint with less confidence than he had shown the day before. Board Chairman Robert Clayton called the meeting to order, his silver hair and expensive suit marking him as someone accustomed to making difficult decisions. We're here to address the formal complaint filed by Dr. Henderson regarding the conduct of paramedic Rebecca Martinez, as well as Dr. Wilson's proposal for implementing new trauma protocols. Dr. Henderson stood first, his presentation polished but lacking the fire Rebecca had expected. Ladies and gentlemen, 3 days ago, Ms. Martinez exceeded her scope of practice, violated hospital protocols, and endangered a patient by performing unauthorized surgery in our trauma bay. He activated a PowerPoint presentation showing hospital policies and paramedic certification requirements. Our protocols exist for good reasons. They ensure patient safety, maintain legal compliance, and preserve the chain of medical authority that keeps our hospital functioning. Rebecca watched the board members' faces as Henderson spoke. Some nodded along with his points, others looked skeptical, and a few appeared more interested in the stack of research Dr. Wilson had provided than in Henderson's presentation. Ms. Martinez claims to have military medical experience, Henderson continued. But even if that's true, battlefield medicine has no place in a civilian hospital. Our patients deserve treatments based on established medical science, not experimental techniques developed in war zones. Board member Dr. Angela Torres raised her hand. Dr. Henderson, what was the outcome for the patient in question? Henderson hesitated. The patient survived, but that doesn't justify. The patient survived because of Ms. Martinez's intervention, Dr. Torres interrupted. Your own notes indicate that he was approaching irreversible shock before she acted. The standard protocols. The standard protocols were failing, said board member James Wright, reviewing the medical chart. According to this timeline, the patient's condition deteriorated rapidly under conventional treatment. Ms. Martinez's intervention immediately stabilized his vital signs. Dr. Wilson stood to present the counter-argument. Board members, what you witnessed was not reckless endangerment, but rather life-saving medical expertise of the highest caliber. She activated her own presentation, showing the research they had compiled. Rebecca Martinez was chief medic for Delta Force Special Operations Units for 7 years. Her innovative trauma techniques have been adopted throughout military medical units and have resulted in documented survival rate improvements of 30 to 60%. The room grew quiet as Dr. Wilson continued. More importantly, civilian hospitals that have incorporated modified military medical techniques show consistent improvements in trauma outcomes. The data is overwhelming. Colonel Patterson stood next, his military bearing commanding immediate respect. Board members, I've had the privilege of working with many exceptional medical professionals during my career. Chief Martinez represents the absolute pinnacle of trauma medical expertise. He gestured to Rebecca. The techniques she developed in combat zones have saved hundreds of lives. Her innovations have been studied, tested, and adopted by military medical units worldwide. To suggest that such expertise has no place in civilian medicine ignores the fundamental fact that medical emergencies are medical emergencies, regardless of setting. Board Chairman Clayton leaned forward. Colonel, can you speak to the safety and effectiveness of these techniques? Absolutely. Chief Martinez's protocols have been rigorously tested under the most demanding conditions possible. They work because they focus on immediate intervention rather than lengthy diagnostic procedures. In trauma medicine, time is literally life. Dr. Henderson stood again, his confidence clearly shaken. Even accepting that Ms. Martinez has extensive military experience, the fact remains that she violated hospital policies. She exceeded her authorized scope of practice. To save a life, Dr. Wilson replied firmly, which is supposed to be our primary mission. Board member Patricia Lopez looked directly at Rebecca. Ms. Martinez, you've been quiet during this discussion. What's your perspective on what happened? Rebecca stood, feeling the weight of everyone's attention. She had prepared remarks, but looking around the room at these people who would determine not just her future, but potentially the future of trauma care at the hospital, she decided to speak from the heart. 3 days ago, I watched a young soldier dying from injuries I've treated many times before. I knew exactly what needed to be done and how to do it. I also knew that acting would reveal things about my background that I'd spent years trying to keep private. She paused, meeting the eyes of each board member. For about 30 seconds, I stood there choosing between protecting my own anonymity and saving a stranger's life. I'm proud of the choice I made. But you did violate protocol, Chairman Clayton pointed out. Yes, I did. And I'd do it again under the same circumstances. Because protocols exist to serve patients, not the other. Way around. Rebecca gestured to the research materials on the table. What you have to decide is whether this hospital wants to continue losing patients to preventable complications, or whether you want to explore medical techniques that could save more lives. Dr. Henderson made one final attempt. This sets assess. Dangerous precedent. If we allow medical personnel to ignore protocols whenever they feel justified, we're not talking about ignoring protocols. Dr. Wilson interrupted. We're talking about updating them based on proven medical innovations. Colonel Patterson stepped forward. Board members, I have authorization to offer St. Mary's Hospital participation in a federal medical exchange program. This would provide significant funding for equipment, training, and research, while giving your staff access to the most advanced trauma techniques available. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Federal funding would allow the hospital to upgrade their facilities dramatically while establishing them as a leader in trauma care innovation. Chairman Clayton called for a brief recess, and the board members huddled in discussion. Rebecca could see animated conversation, pointing at charts, and what appeared to be debate about the proposal's merits. When they reconvened, Chairman Clayton's expression was serious but not hostile. Ms. Martinez, the board has reached a decision regarding Dr. Henderson's complaint. Rebecca held her breath. While we acknowledge that you technically exceeded your authorized scope of practice, we also recognize that your actions saved a patient's life using medically sound techniques. The complaint is dismissed. Dr. Henderson's face flushed red, but he remained silent. Furthermore, Chairman Clayton continued, the board is interested in exploring Dr. Wilson's proposal for updated trauma protocols. Ms. Martinez, would you be willing to work with our medical staff to develop a training program incorporating your expertise? Rebecca felt a surge of emotions, relief, pride, and something that felt very much like coming home. Yes, sir. I'd be honored to. Then, let's discuss how to move forward, Chairman Clayton said with a smile. It sounds like St. Mary's Hospital is about to become a leader in trauma care innovation. 6 months later, Rebecca stood in the newly renovated Trauma Training Center, watching a group of young doctors practice the arterial bleeding control techniques that had once been known only to special operations medics. The federal funding from Colonel Patterson's exchange program had transformed not just the hospital's capabilities, but Rebecca's life as well. Remember, speed and precision are equally important. She called out to Dr. Martinez. No relation, despite sharing the same last name as he worked on the simulation mannequin. You have the knowledge. Trust your hands to execute it. Dr. Wilson entered the training center, carrying a stack of quarterly reports that had become a source of pride for the entire hospital. The latest statistics are in, she announced with satisfaction. Rebecca looked up from supervising the training session. Good news? Outstanding news. Our trauma survival rate has improved by 42% since implementing your protocols. We've gone from middle of the pack to being ranked among the top trauma centers in the state. The transformation had been remarkable. What had started as Rebecca's desperate attempt to save one soldier's life had evolved into a comprehensive overhaul of the hospital's approach to emergency medicine. The quiet paramedic who had hidden her expertise was now the director of trauma training, teaching life-saving techniques to medical professionals from across the region. More importantly, Dr. Wilson continued, we've had 0 preventable deaths from arterial bleeding since your techniques were implemented. 0. Rebecca felt the familiar satisfaction that came from knowing her work was saving lives, but it was different now. In the military, her successes had often been measured by missions completed or casualties prevented. Here, she could see the direct impact on families, communities, and individual futures. Mark approached, wearing the new Trauma Specialist certification, pin that marked his completion of Rebecca's advanced training program. Rebecca, that motorcycle accident from this morning, the techniques you taught us made all the difference. The patient's stable and expected to make a full recovery. That's what we're here for, Rebecca replied, but she smiled with genuine pride. Watching her colleagues master techniques that had once been exclusive to special operations units felt like passing on a legacy that was bigger than any individual achievement. Dr. Henderson appeared in the doorway, his demeanor markedly different from their first confrontation 6 months earlier. The investigation that had followed the board meeting had revealed several cases where his rigid adherence to protocol had contributed to preventable complications. Rather than being terminated, he had requested to join Rebecca's training program. Chief Martinez, he said, using the title that had gradually replaced her civilian designation, I wanted to thank you for the additional instruction on chest trauma management. I used your modified technique on a patient yesterday, and the outcome was significantly better than what I would have achieved with standard protocols. Rebecca nodded, appreciating how much Henderson had changed. His initial hostility had given way to genuine respect as he witnessed the effectiveness of her techniques and the improvement in his own patient outcomes. Doctor, the techniques only work if you trust them completely. Hesitation costs seconds, and seconds cost lives. I'm learning that, Henderson admitted. It's a different mindset than what I was taught in medical school. Different circumstances require different approaches, Rebecca replied. The key is knowing when to apply which technique. Colonel Patterson entered the training center, his regular visits having become a cornerstone of the exchange program. Chief, I have news from Washington. Rebecca gestured for him to continue. The preliminary results from our pilot program here have been so successful that the Pentagon wants to expand it nationwide. They're requesting that you lead the development of standardized civilian military trauma protocols for implementation at hospitals across the country. The offer was both thrilling and daunting. Rebecca had found peace and purpose at St. Mary's, but the opportunity to impact trauma care on a national scale was compelling. What would that involve? Dr. Wilson asked, clearly concerned about losing her star trainer. A combination of on-site consulting, curriculum development, and train-the-trainer programs, Colonel Patterson explained. Chief Martinez would remain based here but travel to other hospitals to establish similar programs. Rebecca considered the proposal carefully. 6 months ago, she had been hiding her expertise, trying to blend into civilian life without drawing attention to her capabilities. Now she was being asked to share her knowledge with the entire country. "I'll need time to think about it," she said finally. "Of course. But Chief, you should know that preliminary data suggests your techniques could prevent thousands of preventable deaths annually if implemented nationwide." The weight of that potential impact settled on Rebecca's shoulders. Thousands of lives that could be saved by sharing knowledge she had gained through years of battlefield experience. After Colonel Patterson left, Rebecca found herself alone in the training center with Dr. Wilson. "You're going to accept, aren't you?" Dr. Wilson said. "I think I have to, if these techniques can save that many lives." "I understand, but I hope you know what you've built here. This hospital is a different place because of you." Rebecca looked around the training center, thinking about all the medical professionals who had learned her techniques, all the patients whose lives had been saved, all the families who had been spared the grief of preventable loss. "It's different because everyone here was willing to learn," she said. "6 months ago, I thought my military experience was something I needed to hide from. Now I realize it was something I needed to share." Dr. Wilson smiled. "From the beginning, I knew you were special. I just didn't realize how special." "I'm not special," Rebecca replied. "I'm just someone who learned how to do a job under difficult circumstances. The real difference has been having people willing to listen and learn." As the evening shift change approached, Rebecca made her rounds through the hospital, checking on patients and consulting with the medical staff. It had become her favorite part of the day, seeing her techniques in action, watching her colleagues apply lessons learned in training, knowing that each successful intervention represented a life-saved dot in the trauma bay where her journey had begun. She found the night shift preparing for their duties. The same bay where she had first revealed her true identity now served as a symbol of how far they had all come. A young paramedic approached her, someone who had recently completed her training program. "Chief Martinez, I wanted to thank you for the confidence you've given us. Knowing these techniques makes me feel like I can handle anything that comes through those doors." Rebecca smiled, remembering her own early days as a combat medic when experienced professionals had shared their knowledge and helped her develop her skills. "The techniques are just tools," she said. "The real power comes from knowing you can make a difference when it matters most." As she prepared to leave for the day, Rebecca reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. The quiet paramedic who had tried to hide her extraordinary capabilities was gone, replaced by someone who understood that true expertise meant nothing if it wasn't shared with others. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Colonel Patterson. "Chief, final decision needed by Friday. The country needs what you have to offer." Rebecca looked around the hospital that had become her second home, at the people who had become her extended family, at the legacy of life-saving knowledge she had built here. She typed back, "I'll do it. Some gifts are too important to keep." To yourself. The transformation was complete. Rebecca Martinez had finally stopped hiding from who she was and had embraced the responsibility that came with extraordinary skills. Her story had become one of courage, growth, and the recognition that true heroes are often the quiet professionals who do their jobs with excellence, humility, and an unwavering commitment to serving others. In a world that often celebrates the loudest voices, Rebecca had learned that sometimes the greatest impact comes from those who speak softly, but carry the kind of expertise that can literally mean the difference between life and death. She had found her peace, not by running from her past, but by using it to build a better future for everyone around her. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.